1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Steve Smith, not the Aussie cricketer, but the Kiwi serial overachiever. I mean, where to begin? Steve is the master of wine, viticulturist, entrepreneur who lifted Villa Maria to the big league, co-created Craggy Range from scratch, and co-founded Aotearoa, New Zealand Fine Wine, whose pinnacle estate is Pyramid Valley in North Canterbury. He visited me on the Mornington Peninsula and we talked about grand designs, ambition and theatre, the newlywed master of wine ultimatum, hiring and inspiring go-getters you can trust, Turunga Waiwai, terroir and transparency, making a cult figure's much-loved passion project your own without losing its soul, being taught to think by a guy named Smart, and how wine might promise escape and optimism in a challenging world. Yes, Steve's come a long way, but where did it all begin?
Well, I was born in Invercargill, the bottom of the South Island of New Zealand. Interestingly enough, my great-great-grandfather was one of New Zealand's most notorious bootleg whiskey makers. So while I may not have a wine background in my past, maybe there was a little alcohol production gene that got passed along. But yes, working class family, farming families, sort of provincial New Zealand and the South Island of New Zealand. Always had a great love of agriculture just because I found myself on farms a lot. I love science. And actually had a great love of architecture. I originally wanted to be an architect and still have a great passion for architecture. And for various reasons, when I was leaving high school, the architecture thing didn't really play out, but there was an opportunity to work for the Ministry of Agriculture in a scholarship agricultural science role, which I thought that'd be cool because I love that stuff. It was in entomology, which I knew nothing about. But I got that scholarship and went to work at Ruakura Research Centre, which at the time was the largest agricultural research centre in the Southern Hemisphere, in Hamilton, so miles away from home, 17 years old, and just got posted to a research team that had just started work on phylloxera.
Right.
Interestingly enough, just before I went there, I remember seeing a news program of a new wine region that had just been opened up just outside Auckland, and I saw it on the TV, and it sort of left some sort of memory with me because I remembered it, and then next thing you know, I happened to be a little bit closer to viticulture. So it happened entirely by chance, just through that opportunity to become an academic for a few years.
Right, and so where did that take you to next work-wise then?
I did that program where you work and you learn a bit of agriculture science and went and did my postgrad diploma at Lincoln University, and then when I came back from that, Richard Smart had just been appointed as our national viticultural scientist, and I came back. I moved from working on entomology and phylloxera to full-time on viticulture, and that was a very incredible part of my career because Richard, controversial viticultural scientist, but like all great academics, his great premise is he makes you think. And for me, it was like working for this guy that it was the leading edge of that and thinking every day. So that's taken me all the way through my career.
Yeah, when you say controversial, this was a time of enormous evolutionary thinking in viticulture. So There would have been things, I'm sure, that you brought on at that time that really were cutting edge, but also things, as always happens in wine, that you whittle away and come up with your own toolkit for these things.
Yeah, and I think, Richard was more revolutionary, I think, than evolutionary, and he was willing to throw a whole lot of the premises about yield and quality out the door, and that he was very much driven by canopy management and how vine looks and how you work with that. But again, like a lot of academics, sometimes impractical, and, I was working alongside of him, and my job became, well, how do we think about this in a way that actually could be applied? And, some of the work we did then has become standard practice throughout New Zealand now. We cleaned up the whole vineyard. It was infected with virus. We came up with a whole rootstock protocol. So a lot of the work led by Richard with me chasing after him has become sort of a fundamental part of New Zealand wine industry now. So it's great to look back on that. That started in the 80s. So it's incredible.
You say he's taught you to think. A lot of people will think that with your accomplishments to date, everything's somehow been routine, but I'm sure that you've spent almost all of that time being somewhat out of your depth, but dealing with things, because you really have, starting with Villa Maria, been thrown some big challenges that you've obviously grasped with both hands. So tell us a little bit about what you faced there and how you went about it.
I don't know whether it came from Richard, but I think I naturally have a sort of similar view. I've never wanted to be doing things the same way as everyone else, the same when I was a little kid. And so I think that sort of stuck with me in everything I did. And to go and work for Villa Maria when Villa Maria was in receivership from a safe government job as a viticultural scientist, I knew I wanted to get involved in the commercial side of it. I'd been lucky enough to spend 6 months at Davis and spent a lot of time on the Robert Mondavi vineyards, one of the most influential New World wine vignerons ever, probably when he was starting. I left California coming back knowing I still loved the academic side, but I loved this idea of a piece of land and what you can make from this piece of land and how you can grow things differently and how it reflects that place, and then how you can put a brand around that. I guess that's where my architecture, the design side of my brain has always been thinking away, and it's fairly creative. So somewhat naively went and worked for a company in receivership, but for George, he had a clear vision of what he wanted to do, and he had no money. In the famous words of Ernest Rutherford, so Ernest Rutherford was one of New Zealand's great academics. In fact, he was the first person in the world to split the atom. He did it in a galvanised shed or a little work shed in Canterbury University. Once he did that, he went to Oxford. In his opening address to the Oxford faculty, he introduced himself as, "My name is Ernest Rutherford. I come from New Zealand. We have no money, so we have to think." And I think that's a pretty cornerstone part of a lot of innovative New Zealand companies and people that have done quite edgy things. I mean, the guy that runs Rocket Lab now, whoever thought we'd have a major space program in New Zealand driven by a guy who just loved making rockets when he was a kid. So I think that DNA sort of sits through a lot of New Zealanders, and I must have a decent dose of it, I think.
A couple of things I want to pick up there. One, Mondavi, the connection there, such a big name that it's become almost emblematic rather than perhaps some of the more intricate lessons that you probably learnt there. Mm-hmm. What did you see at Mondavi that ignited your imagination?
Well, I was working at Davis, and a lot of the research trials were held on the Mondavi vineyard because Robert Mondavi himself was very innovative and wanted to understand things, and he was at the leading edge of Napa, and this was in the mid 80s. And I met him a few times, and just seeing he was 60 years old when he started Mondavi, that's incredible to have that energy. And, he was a wonderful man, and what he was doing and the wines he was making, but it started from a viticultural base. I mean, to me, I just got so excited about that. And Napa is still one of my favourite parts of the wine world to see. They're still leading edge from a technology point of view and a science point of view and an ambition point of view, very ambitious wine region. So again, I've just been lucky to have these chance interactions with, I guess I made my own luck to get the scholarship to go to Davis, but then to spend some time with him and then to be part of, the rebirth of Villa was special. And, so I've just been lucky to have that chance, I think.
Yeah, so that vision at Villa, what was the plan?
George had to get himself out of receivership, and he decided that we are going to win the trophy for every major wine style in New Zealand at the National Wine Awards. And that was the single proposition that he'd come up with his marketing professor, who was his consultant, a guy called Steve Bridges, where I learnt all my marketing and brand stuff from, because when you work for a Yugoslav company, and with George, you're part of the family, so everyone's at the table when you're making the decision, so you get exposed to a bunch of stuff. I had to rebuild the vineyard and viticulture base for him, and I was a very annoying viticulturalist because I wanted to be involved in the winery as well, and I want to understand the brand and all of that stuff. So he gave me the license to do that.
How long were you there, and what were some of the sort of milestones along the way?
I went there in 87 and I left to start Craggy in 98, 99, so I was there for 10 or 11 years. I guess the milestones were financial survival and understanding that the only way we could survive is if we could get good grapes, and that we could only get good grapes because we didn't have our own vineyards. If the growers trusted us to buy their grapes and they were going to get paid, which was pretty hard when that company was in receivership. So I learned a lot about people and personal relationships and the trust that I was, by saying I'll buy your grapes, I was making a personal obligation, in my view anyway, that we could pay them. And so that was a pretty instrumental part of me thinking about my professional life and probably personal life for the future is this idea of trust. Sort of sat with me through everything. I think I got the opportunity at Villa also to become the front for the brand with some changes in winemaking personnel. So I sort of stepped into that role, which I loved, but I also got frustrated that I was always regarded as a viticulturist, which is a guy that drives a tractor and, wears gumboots. And I thought, I'm not that guy. But how can I get rid of that vision that people have of viticulturists? So I thought, you know what, I've got to do the Master of Wine. And so that was driven by that idea, and because no other viticulturist in the world had it, and I was a reasonably competitive person, and 2 or 3 of my friends had passed it first time, I thought, okay, I've got to give this a shot. And if I get it right, it'll change my professional life.
What was that journey like? You threw yourself into that with pretty laser-sharp focus, I'm sure.
Yeah, Laura and I, my wife, we'd been talking about it for a while, and then actually it was on the morning after our wedding. She said, well, are you going to do the Master of Wine? I said, I'm still thinking about it. What do you think? She said, I think you should do it, but here's the deal. I want to have kids within a couple of years. So you've got 2 years, because we're certainly not going to do it when we've got kids.
Nothing like a deadline.
Yeah, nothing like a deadline. And so I said, right, yeah, I'm going to give up everything else that I have in my life apart from the work I do for Villa. Obviously, we're newly married, but we moved out of our house. She gave up her job, and she put everything into it, organising all of that for me. And and it taught me an enormous amount about how much you can cram into your mind and learning in a very short space, but there was a very laser focus on that.
And how have you used that since then?
I think for me it was a lot of things happened after I passed it, and one of the most notable things, I got picked in a couple of world lists of people that were going to be influential in the new millennium, one of them being in Decanter magazine, I guess because I had a viticultural bent, but my love was brand and wine, so which was quite new at the time. And that article happened to be read by Terry Peabody when Terry was looking at an investment in the wine business, and he decided that he wanted to come to New Zealand. So he basically called me and said, look, I'm looking for some land. He'd had a couple of recommendations. To find some land, you need to talk to Steve because he knows the right stuff to buy. And I bought the Gimlet Gravels land for Craggy at that time. Terry didn't even see it, sight unseen. And I was still working for Villa Maria at the time, but looking to move into a consulting role. And I said to Terry, look, I can only do this if you agree to sell a portion of this land to Villa Maria, because they want some of it as well. And that was nothing written down. It was all about trust between all of us. And Terry did that. So that totally changed my life, because all of a sudden, what started as a consulting relationship to buy land, all of a sudden, after I met Terry for the first weekend, they're offering me the job to lead the business as CEO. And I was 36 years old, never run a business in my life. Didn't probably realise at the time how ambitious it was, but I certainly wasn't scared by it, because Terry wanted to build a beautiful winery, and it was from scratch, so it was greenfield. You didn't have to clean anyone else's mess up. It was like, this is like dream come true stuff for me. So of course I said yes. So
when you were doing that for Craggy, how much had you seen at Villa Maria in terms of regions and wines and styles?
The great thing about Villa is that I was able to work in all of the major wine growing regions, but also had spent a little bit of time in Martinborough just for personal interest in, and also had been a co-founder in Peregrine Wines with Greg Hay, so I got to know Central quite well. So I had a really clear picture. New Zealand had been through the first phase of its new wine journey of planting a lot of vineyards in the wrong place. So now you knew where we wanted to plant the right vineyards, and you could understand with the top wines we were making at Villa, they were truly world class. I knew there was a great opportunity, Terry also being ambitious, there was a great opportunity to craft a new wine business it wasn't without fear, but with the knowledge that you're at the time in the evolution of the New Zealand wine industry for this to happen. Cloudy Bay had done it with Sauvignon Blanc just prior to this, and I saw there was room for another story. And I loved the Gimlet Gravels. I was part of a small group of growers that saved that land from being a gravel mine. So for me to get an opportunity to then plant it in vineyard was like, my God, that's gold. And Terry didn't have any idea of what he knew what he wanted to do in the big picture, but he had no idea how to do it. He wasn't a wine person necessarily, but his wife and daughter just wanted this for the future of their family. So I was able to hatch the plan as well as carry it out. So that was cool.
And would it be roughly true that the idea of the world-class wines at Villa were world-class for New Zealand, sort of the first round of technical world-class as opposed to artisanal world-class? Like, was this a time when you were ready to go to Craggy and go, you know what, I've had a look at greatness and ambition in Napa. I know what the next level of this big vision is?
Yeah, that's a very good sum up, because even during my Villa time, I'd gone back to Napa a bit, and I love Bordeaux. In the middle of my time at Villa, I spent 3 or 4 months in the UK actually playing cricket, and then got injured and went to France and spent a lot of time in the wine regions there, fell in love with Bordeaux. I guess you'd seen in Hawke's Bay what Tomato had done with the Coleraine, and seen what Trinity Hill had just started to do and Stonecroft had started to do, and you thought, you know what, you could do a Napa-like, Bordeaux-like New Zealand version right here. It gave me the confidence to know that we weren't just firing an arrow at, a dark room.
With the Gimlet Gravels, you were also instrumental in the appellation.
Yeah.
So it's probably a good time to talk about what exactly that land has in that region, more generally of Hawke's Bay, especially the Gravels, in terms of the geographical advantages on its side for fine wine.
Yeah, so what is now known as the Gimlet Gravels wine growing region was one of the last areas to be planted in vines in Hawke's Bay. Chris Pask and Alan Limmer were the first people to plant there, and they did it because they could get land very cheaply and nothing else would grow there, but they sort of had an idea that vines might grow there. And, the very first wines that were made from Alan's vineyard at Stonecroft and Chris's vineyard at Pask, we bought the grapes off some of those at Villa, and it was like, oh my God, this is another level. But the unfortunate thing is the area didn't have a name. There was Gimlet Road, and then there was Highway 50, and then there was a motor racing strip there. There was the old Hastings dump next door, so nobody had a name for it. And also the character of the wines were very much related to this old riverbed. There's only 880 hectares of it. It's in one specific area, and it was away from the ocean, so it was warmer, which in Hawke's Bay for reds is really important. And so we had the basis for forming an appellation to give the region a name, but also put a boundary around it that had a meaningful status that influences the wines that are made from there. So, we did that in 2001. There was, 35 wine growers and winemakers, all with different ideas, and it's still one of my proudest achievements to be able to get all of those people to agree on a clear proposition is this is home to some very fine, full-bodied red wines. Even though people made Chardonnay and Gewurz and Sauvignon and stuff, it was great. And even though times are very tough in Hawke's Bay at the moment, with everything in the wine world that's difficult, that place will endure, and it's made some of New Zealand's most famous and most expensive red wines.
Yeah, and quite forward-looking again, around the turn of the millennium, to be moving New Zealand into that fine wine paradigm of origin being so important, tying that to quality and making that clear. I mean, it's given a real identity. Obviously, it's a fairly old world model, but it really works, doesn't it?
It absolutely works. And I guess that's what the combination of doing the Master of Wine did for me, spending a bunch of time in those famous regions in France and also in Napa. You realise the things that are important if you're going to be making, high-end wines in places. And, the beauty about that region is it gave us another unique world-first opportunity, and it is the only appellation in the world that's absolutely defined by soil type. For wine drinkers in that's an easy story to tell. Like there's no politics here. There's no list of things you have to adhere to. It's like you're either in or you're out. And Mother Nature is determined whether you're in or out, not politics.
Also, Martinborough was pretty dear to your heart. So again, from that sort of zooming out a little bit point of view, what is Martinborough about versus Hawke's Bay in terms of their attributes?
Yeah, so we bought the land in the Gimlet Gravels for Terry and then agreed to join him in the business. And we were sitting down framing what the business would look like. And I said, look, we've got the Gimlet Gravels land. It's a great full-bodied red wines vineyard and a great Chardonnay vineyard. But actually, if we want to achieve your vision, he wanted to create one of the world's great wine estates within his lifetime. So he was 60 at the time, so it's like, okay, let's give it 20 years, which is still not very long time, but hey, I'm up for a challenge. And then the second thing, he wanted the wines sold in the great restaurants of the world. So I made a call that said, you're not going to be able to do that unless we've got Sauvignon, because at that stage, Sauvignon was the door opener for everything. And to sell the wines in the great restaurants of the world, you need to have great distributors. And great distributors will only take you on if you have some scale and you have some Sauvignon. And I remember Terry said, I hate Sauvignon. I said, well, give me a couple of days. So I went away and did a business plan with and without Sauvignon, and he very quickly changed his mind. And I said, look, we can't go to Marlborough because the great Marlborough Sauvignon is being created with Cloudy Bay. You can't recreate or chase Cloudy. If you go there, we'll be chasing them. But Martinborough, to me, has got a lot of similar characteristics. It's relatively unknown. There's a little bit of Sauvignon made there that I love, but no one's really grabbed grabbed the attention for Martinborough. And also from a world stage, most of the world will see it as very much like Marlborough anyway, because it also starts with an M and A and an R. So from a communications point of view, it wasn't too difficult. And he said, okay, let's go. So I spent 6 or 8 months in Martinborough covertly looking at land, and found this land at the end of Timuna Road, which had not had a vineyard near it. There was 3 trial rows somewhere, but nobody knew what they looked like because it was mostly eaten by sheep. And bought 160 hectares for Terry at that point. And unbeknownst to me, the week prior, Larry McKenna had bought the piece of land next door for escarpment.
Right.
So I quickly lost my nervousness, and Larry had been living there for 25 years, and he knew this was his place for escarpment. So for me, it was like, wow, I somehow got very lucky again.
Dwelling on Craggy before we move on, for a 36-year-old, as you say, a great opportunity, one that you got to tackle, I suppose, when you'd already had quite a few strings to your bow with the Master of Wine behind you, with some amazing and quite broad experience at Villa, where you were also, if not taking risks, certainly not onto a surefire winner. So what was the joyride of Craggy like? Because I'm sure there were some moments where you had to hold your nerve there.
Absolutely. There was moments to hold your nerve. But I guess, I was thinking about this yesterday, is that period in New Zealand from the 80s through to around 2010 is like our golden ages. Like that was an era where anything was possible. And, with Terry, he was ambitious. He wanted to do great things. He wanted to build the beautiful buildings and stuff like that. And there was times it was scary, like when you're writing out big checks when you're building those buildings. And I'm going, oh my God, that's a lot of money. But, Terry was confident that we were going in the right direction. We had lots of challenging conversations along the way about what we should do and what we shouldn't do. At the end of the day, he really did understand that I came from a background that was about what we were trying to do, and he didn't. And as long as what we were doing reflected his ambitions, he gave me a fairly open license to do it. We went through the GFC at Craggy, which is right in the middle of building this business, which, it was a hard time for Terry, his other businesses, and ourselves. So we had to hang on during that. And I think we came out of that as a better business, because the first 10 years was always so, we were making 5 single vineyard Rieslings and 6 single vineyard Sauvignons and all that sort of stuff. And it gave us an opportunity to learn from all of that and reframe the business moving forward. And it was a wonderful time in my career. And I got to build some beautiful buildings too.
So that scratches the architecture itch as well. But also there's an element, isn't there, of imagination, theatre, and bringing something for people to get excited about, which I feel is another thing that sort of stuck with you as almost an imperative. So Craggy, was that also a real way of getting feedback on what kind of excitement you could deliver to people through wine?
Yeah, I think so. And I think you see when you go to those great properties in Napa or Bordeaux or Burgundy, you're somewhere special. And when I chose the piece of land for Craggy and I said, Terry, this is where I think it should be, and we should call it Craggy, he just said, let's go for it. And we chose that deliberately. The name felt like a New Zealand name, and the outlook of that property is spectacular. And so the idea became, well, let's build a beautiful winery, but let's make sure we do it in a way that everybody wants to visit. And when they're there, they get excited. They walk onto this place and they turn around and look at the back of Tomato Peak, or they look at their buildings and they go, wow, I'm somewhere special. Because if they have that feeling, they're going to take that with them everywhere. And then Terry's dream of having the wines served and sold in the great restaurants of the world will be real, because those people may have been to visit us and then they're back home and they buy it off a list or at a fine wine store. Yeah, there's definitely some theatre, and the architecture side of it was to create that as well. And John Blair, we selected John to do this, and we spent a lot of time together over the 5 years of designing and building that, and enough time for him to say about me that I know enough about architecture to be very dangerous, and I say of him, he knows enough about wine to be very dangerous. I think we got the balance right there between, architects always want to do something very glamorous, and also for the Peabody family, they've got beautiful houses everywhere. They love beautiful places, but to me it needed to feel very New Zealand, and the local farmer had to come and take his boots off at the door of the restaurant and walk in if he wanted to come and have lunch. If we didn't do that, then we haven't achieved the right thing, because it still needed to feel like it's New Zealand.
Very good. Your name's been attached to a lot of these achievements that have been fairly groundbreaking, but I'm sure as well that you've had to take people along for the journey in terms of recruiting / collaborating with people. What's your sort of approach to making sure that you're working with the right people, finding, hiring, liaising with people who are going to come along for the ride and put in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know whether I can answer that in a very deliberate way, but I understand when you're doing a project like that, the relationship with people at every level becomes incredibly important. I think for Terry and I, we very quickly developed a trust that we were both trying to do the same thing here, and I was very conscious of his investment that was going to be significant, and I was wanting to do the right thing for him. And then I love hiring young people that have got a similar sense of ambition. And when you do that, the most important thing is to make sure there's a security blanket around them that they can't drop off the cliff. We hired a very young American winemaker at Craggy to start with. He had a very good friend of mine as his consultant who was, older and more experienced than me. So there was always a blanket there. And I think once you build that culture, you tend to then attract really good people because they want to come and work for you. A lot of what we did was at distance, so the Martinborough vineyard was at distance. So the most important thing for me then is having a vineyard manager that I can trust. And it was only really difficult when I had the wrong person. I don't know, I think you build it over time. I think you build this sense of people that you want to be around. The older you get, the less patience you have for people you don't want to be around, for sure. I think any experience you have in the world of wine, it's amazingly collaborative with people globally. If any of my family want to get a job in California and go and work in a vineyard or a cellar or a restaurant or something, there's that mutual collaboration that we all have in the wine world. As I remember Terry Peabody saying to me, Steve, why do you drink so many of our competitors' wines? I said, they're not competitors. I'm learning from everyone. And by the way, they're drinking ours, Terry. So, yeah, and I think ideas come out of my head left, right and centre all the time. But I always have a view that the idea that I might have come up with is nowhere near as good as the idea that we come up with together that might come from that. Yeah. And so my role in a lot of what I've done has been throwing these ideas on the table, and we pull it to pieces and put it together, and then it comes back with something that's much more compelling.
Yeah, it's a really interesting world with a lot of diverse people, and there is a lot of passion within it. And I guess you can recognise those people who are so inspired by something that they're going to grab it with two hands and really get to grips with it and enjoy it. And there was quite a strong vision, even if it was something that needed to be worked out. There was a plan really to what you had to achieve at Villa. There was a plan at Craggy to what that had to be.
Yeah.
And I guess that also helps.
Yeah, but also even with Pyramid, when you're getting those key people on board with you, a bunch of people that were looking at those jobs just did not get it. You could just sense that they did not get it. And we ended up with the people that got it. They just get the idea and go, oh my God, I get this. And, the Pyramid winemaking role was even more interesting because you needed an ambitious winemaker, but also somebody that was really wanting to get their hands dirty, both in the vineyard and the winery. So you couldn't have some desk-bound glory winemaker because it just would not have worked.
Really look forward to talking about Pyramid and the team there in a little while. But while we're on that subject of leadership and collaboration, you've been really proud and continue to be very active in what people might call mentorship roles as well, but also the chancellorship at Lincoln University. Yeah. How important is it for someone like you to be involved in the development of people?
I don't think I've got a conscious way of saying I must be involved in the development of people. I just do not have a plan for anybody. My simple philosophy is my phone's always on for you, the door's always open. Never ever feel like you are alone if you're having to think about things that are different. I'm going to leave you alone once you've got the idea of what we're trying to do, but I'm here to help you. And there are times when you're in those leadership roles you need to make a call because there's different views, right? And you've got to make a call and you've got to try and have people on the same page as you with that call. And that can be the harder thing. Inspirational projects I love being able to be part of, and I love leading them. It's just something that I falls naturally to me, and I don't think about it too much. Once I've got an idea about what I think we need to do to bring it to life, then you make sure you've got the right people around you and we're all on the journey. So
yeah. And also, much as you love other places, you love New Zealand. I mean, you're really driven to see that do well in all facets.
Yeah, I do. I'm very proud New Zealander, and I don't know where the saying came from, but the saying was if you took a little bit of confidence out of Australia and you put it into New Zealand, it'd be good for both countries. I think that might have been our Prime Minister, actually, Robert Mondavi, which is a great saying because we sort of suffer from the little cousin attitude sometimes. I'd love to see more ambition. I'd love to see New Zealand have 20 Craggy Ranges from an ambition point of view, because I think we've got the potential to be there, but we don't have that at the moment. And so I've spent a lot of sat on a bunch of government boards around Brand New Zealand and all of those things. And I sort of have this sort of thing about our country is that every time you experience something from New Zealand, it's good for you, whether that be the human interaction, because New Zealand is, that's what people love about us as Kiwis. But the quality of the food, the health of the food, the tourism experience, the place experience, the aha moments when you're sitting on a road on the side of a mountain, in a mountain range in the South Island, and you're only an hour away from Christchurch. Is these moments, or on our vineyard at Pyramid, or you just have these moments that go, God, this is so special. There's a base to New Zealand that's quite interesting. The last rock to come out of the ocean, like the youngest country in the world. Last place to be settled by humans. And it was settled by humans 900 years ago. It was a country of rainforests and birds, and most of those birds were flightless because there was no predators. And when you tell that story to people, they can see this glazed look in their eyes, and they go, what do you mean there's no predators? There's nothing in New Zealand that can kill you. And yet 1,600 kilometres away on the other side of the Tasman is a country that's got more things that can kill you than anything else. So I just think there's a wonderful essence to the story. And I think the last 5 or 6 years have been tough for the country. And I think we need to get our mojo back.
I would say that the message does cut through. I mean, everyone's trying to get messages out into a very noisy world these days. I mean, that identity of New Zealand is so strong. And I mean, I've been there a couple of times and I love it. And I feel like everyone I interact with around the world who knows New Zealand gets the same thing. It's an incredibly strong identity overseas when you go and visit your export markets. How is the perception of New Zealand wine at the moment, and how do you think you could sharpen it up?
It's a great question. I think we've sort of been tarnished with one brush right now with the predominance of the New Zealand story about wine being Marlborough Sauvignon and, value for money, refreshing white wine that is Marlborough Sauvignon. And that's come about because the industry is dominated by very large New Zealand-owned companies, but also international companies, and Sauvignon plays a specific role in their portfolios. And it's been incredibly commercially successful, so you can't get away from that story. My intense frustration is the New Zealand wine industry is an ambidextrous industry. It needs the Marlborough Sauvignon story, but sitting alongside it is the fine wine story. Yep. And the fine wine story is not getting any voice, or getting minimal voice, because it's not the big commercial side of the industry. We're doing a lot to try and make sure that voice is being told, and there's a number of great producers that can stand up beside some of the great wines in the world and know that it's valid. And so how do we get that? There's a few things in the back of my mind how that could be achieved, but we just need to be given a chance to be on the same table as some of these great wines, and I think if they are, then the wines show strongly.
Okay, well, I think that brings us to the current projects that you have on. Many and varied, but a very united front. So Pyramid Valley, we'll start there. You obviously took over a vineyard and a project that had a lot of affection attached to it. Mike and Claudia's vision, very singular place. What was it like as an opportunity/challenge to take on something that people were very fond of, but very closely associated with the vision of a set of people?
It's another great question. I think probably at the time I did not realise how significant that association was, knowing that we wanted to obviously celebrate what Mike and Claudia had achieved. And they developed this little cult status for Pyramid Valley, making tiny volumes of wines, and sometimes controversial wines that were on the edge of being appropriate or not. Mike, before he became unwell, was an amazing communicator, and he was able to just put people in raptures about what he was doing. And I spent 2 years going back to Pyramid and talking with Mike and Claudia, almost like earning their respect and having a right for Brian to purchase it. And I knew it was a very special place. But we almost had to start from scratch, knowing that there was still people around the world that loved the wines, but the wines had become a little more edgy over the last vintages that Mike and Claudia were there. So it was a rebuild, there's no doubt about that. And the thing now is, I think we've earned the trust of all of those people that doubted us, because the thing was, Steve's come from Craggy, he's going to do a Craggy with Pyramid, it's going to lose all of the values that it has. What they don't realise is that I'm a Gemini. So there's two sides to my brain, and this is the brain that loves nature and loves smaller projects that are highly tuned and about the land and about humility and all of those things. And so this was my opportunity to be part of that. And we tiptoed very gently around things. And then we've had everything thrown at us since we started. We COVID, not one thing, but, wipeout frosts and all sorts of different things that have challenged us. And to be honest, that period gave us a chance to reframe what Pyramid looks like moving forward, and with a very clear vision, which is to be one of the world's great producers of cool climate Chardonnay and Pinot, because we believe we have the assets to do that. And when you try a lion's tooth or you try a snake's tongue, those wines are very distinctive, and they can only come from our place because our place is so special for making those wines. But yeah, it was an interesting journey, actually. Mike passing away in 21 almost gave us an opportunity to celebrate his life. We had a lot of his friends and a lot of people that were involved in Pyramid came to that memorial and realised that actually we treasure what Mike and Claudia did, and we are now guardians of that vision, and our job is to bring it to life in a way that we think is the right way. And I think nearly everyone that's been close to Pyramid Valley looks at the wines now and they go, well, they've done what they said they were going to do.
Yeah, well, let's dwell on that a little bit, that specialness, because you knew what you were taking on in terms of the potential. Some closely identifiable traits of ambition and vision that came before you, but also this was an interesting area for grape growing, the original vineyard, and also one that was all about nature. You're a viticulturist first and foremost, before you added all the extra stuff on. What is it about those pockets in Waikari, etc., that are really exciting from a viticultural point of view? What are the challenges as well?
Yeah, I mean, these are pieces of land that when you visit, they're just spectacularly beautiful. So you've got to get your head past that, because that doesn't determine whether it's good for wine, but they are spectacularly beautiful. If you look at the foundation of Pyramid, I mean, climatically, it's on the edge. You're talking about less than 1,000 growing degree days. So you know that you are on the edge of ripening Chardonnay and Pinot, but we also know that if you're on the edge, you get the opportunity to make the greatest examples of those wine styles in the world. So when you marry that up with those soils, those limestone clay marl soils, I describe it as rarer than a tuatara in the wild. Tuatara is our very rare native lizard that survived the dinosaur wipeout. And if you look at the heritage of those soils, going back 60 or 70 million years and how they were formed in exactly the same way as the soils of Burgundy. And Mike tells this story, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but it's a great story, and I think it probably is. When he was looking for this land, he was taking soil samples and sending them back to Claude Bourguignon in Burgundy. Have I found the right spot? Have I found the right spot? And he sent some soil from Waikari. And the story goes that Claude sent a note back to Mike by fax, because emails weren't the thing then, and saying, I thought you were looking in New Zealand, not Burgundy. So those soils are very, very special. They don't happen in many places in the world, and particularly in places where you've got the right climate to grow great Chardonnay and great Pinot. I feel even more excited about the potential of that place and also the Lowburn property more now than I was even at the start, because we're starting to see real clarity in the wines that come from there. Under Mike, a lot of that was about the way that Mike made the wines with the whole natural wine movement. We've added a lot of detail to the way that we make those wines without adding anything, just detail and human insights and Hugh's hard work. There's nowhere else in the world that those wines can come from, really. They feel like, some of the old British wine merchants have said to me, this feels like Burgundy in the 70s and 80s when it was cooler. That's what we see the opportunity as. And I think the key in the fine wine world now is to make a wine that can come from nowhere else, because no one can copy you then. To me, there's a difference between proper fine wine that is really from a place and what I call the glamour wines of the world that are more from a producer, because if they're from a producer, then someone else can copy you, but they can't copy you if it comes from a special piece of land.
Yeah, those really are special plots up there. And also, as you said, you've got the other side of that. So down there in Central Otago, what are the natural advantages and the excitement about that? Because those wines are never going to look like the other wines.
Yeah, so for me, when we bought Pyramid, I said to Brian, this is really on the edge. We're going to have some vintages that we don't produce. And so from a business point of view, it's just not right that this is the only estate that we have. And Pyramid's been making Central Otago Pinot for a long time with the Calvert Vineyard project. So I think we should look for a Pinot Noir home, if you like, in Central Otago, because I felt, even though the Pinots from Waikari are really identifiable, to me it was potentially great Chardonnay side. Chardonnay was going to be the main story. So could we find a property in Central that could tell a similar story? So, I spent a few months basically, and this is the beauty about the wine industry, people knew I was looking, but I was able to go into cellars and taste wines of all the people you've known for a long time, and all of the wines that I loved came from soils that had this pedogenic lime in them and weren't from the really schisty, sandy soils, so there was a little bit of Lewis. So the Valleys, the Felton Roads, the Prophet's Rock, the Burn Cottages, all of those wines were like, this is the thing. And sitting in amongst that was a little brand called Lowburn Ferry, which was a little 3-hectare vineyard, not the elite of central Pinot producers, but winning, trophies all over the world for their Pinot and making totally delicious wines. And again, just got lucky. They were looking at selling, and it's got the pedogenic lime and high pH soils that Pyramid Valley has at Waikari. So there's a common denominator there. So I felt we found the vineyard that can be our home for Central Pinot. So, it follows, one of the great New World fine wine producers is Ridge in California. And, they started at Montebello in the hills above Cupertino and in the valley there, and then formed a base up at Lytton Springs. So they, Ridge Montebello, Ridge Lytton Springs, it was the two sort of estate idea. And so, okay, let's take the same route, learn off Paul. So.
Yeah, and Snake's Tongue's already announced itself pretty defiantly, I think, out in the world as a lovely addition there. A great name as well. Plus, you've got the same team. You were talking about having good people around you. Yep. Hugh Kinch and Nick Paulin. Tell us a little bit about the vineyard ethos.
Nick's a biodynamic specialist from Felton Road. Hugh came from escarpment. And the more time he was at escarpment, as Larry was stepping away, he had more and more of an influence. And I guess for all of us, our job is making decisions that help us reflect the place in the season. And nature sits at the core of this. We also know that every part of that is about detail. So the little details in these vineyards are very important. And the beauty about both of those guys is they would rather be in the winery or in the vineyard doing stuff than sitting behind a computer on a spreadsheet. That's what we need, because Hugh lives on the property with his family and he spends way too much time at work, but he sees the opportunity to make some of the most special wines in the world. So, and I trust them implicitly because I know that they'll call me when they need my help. And there are many times I call them where they don't need my help and tell me to go away, and it's part of the relationship that we have. My job is to encouraging them to be a little more brave and a little more stretching the boundaries a little bit and say, how can we push this a little bit further? What can we do here? What can we do there to make things work? So yeah, they're like carbon copies of each other, but one's a viticultural guy that loves wine and one's a wine guy that loves viticulture. So yeah, it's special.
And with that ethos, we've got terms that we're sort of churning over between sustainability, organics, regenerative viticulture, biodynamics, and I've heard you mention the term biodynamics 2.0, which I think is a little bit of biodynamics without the woo-woo, but also they're constantly changing. How do you wrap these different ideas of viticulture together as what their actual function is for the aim that you're trying to achieve?
I'm not a big fan of anything that controls inputs. It probably doesn't surprise you. So that's the thing from an organics or biodynamics point of view. They are all about sustainable programs. They're all about controlling inputs. That has no interest for me. What has an interest for me is what the outcomes are. And the outcomes for us that if we sit around the table, if all of us sit around the table in any part of our business, is one, we want to make great wine. We want those vineyards to be yielding at a level and producing fruit for us that makes it work for us as a business. We want to use nature as the basis for that. Then we throw in some science and we throw in some technology with the idea that whatever we do, we know the wine is going to be better, the environment's going to be better, the people that work in the vineyard are going to be happier, and we're going to have a great wine business out of it. Unfortunately, it doesn't come with a badge like biodynamics or organics, which consumers can get their head around. But when I talk about this to people to say, hey, the Snake's Tongue part of our vineyard, we've been growing multi-species cover crops in there for 5 years. We've taken it from a block that was lucky to make our estate wine to now our top block because essentially of that. How did that happen? Well, we looked after the soil. How did you do that? Multiple cover crops. What does that do? Well, we took soil organic matter from 3% to 6% in 3 years. What does that mean? That means there's 150 tonnes more carbon per hectare in that soil than there was before. We've got climate change we've got a responsibility for. That's great. And one of the great benefits for that is there's 200,000 litres of water per hectare in that soil that wasn't there before. And that means we haven't had to irrigate this year. How good is that? And if you look at that soil is alive. To quote a famous James Milton quote, when you walk across a beautiful paddock or in a beautiful vineyard where the soil is healthy, remember you're walking on the roof of another kingdom. Nick and I hatched that plan for Snake's Tongue together. And to see that come to life so quickly and to see the health of the vineyard, there's more energy in the place. There's more life in the place. Climate change is a game changer. And we need to build a much more resilient vineyard than what we have currently, which is essentially a monoculture. And we know that biologically diverse ecosystems in any type of organism are much, much more resilient than monocultures, right across the board. Bacteria and fungi talk to each other. when they've got lots of different things that they can work with, they can talk to each other and they talk to the vine root and they go and get nutrients for it. Once we've been able to understand that, which science has been able to do now, which it wasn't able to do 10 years ago, all of a sudden a different world opens up. And I think a lot of the science and technology side of viticulture and some of the conventional viticulture is, I think it's been misrepresented in the negatives that it has. But similarly, I think if you can solve things with nature, then that's a better approach as well. But it's a combination of the two that I think is a game changer. And you know, we end up with the healthiest vines and the best tasting wine, and that is good for the people, good for the planet. And, you know, Nick has all his vineyard manager mates drive around the road on a Sunday to see what he's doing, you know, when he's not there. So, you know, it's an exciting time. And when you see great regenerative farms in any form, there's a sense about them that is more than just producing something.
As you said, though, it doesn't come with a badge. It's really important, I think, to remember that people can actually handle some nuance in the conversation. In fact, I think that they want to hear it. And I think there's an awful lot of scope for delivering those holistic messages and not trying to bound them together with an easy fix title. Because let's face it, the people we'd hope would enjoy these wines or we'd like to drink these wines with, they've got lots of different things in their heads around what their priorities are and how they would like to see the world around them evolve. And I think having that confidence to actually say, well, our story is a little bit complex, but we'd love to tell you about it.
Yeah, and finding a way to make that complex story simple. So how can you get the snapshots of that? You know, the 7-word line that people go, oh my God, that's amazing. And then you give them the opportunity to dive into different parts of it. Someone might be interested in the cover crop story. Some people might be interested in the carbon story, or, you know, these plants like the snake stung blue borage plant. What's the story around that? So how can you give them the opportunity to dive into that? Because you'll have a different part of that story that you want to hear than somebody next door. And I agree with you. I don't like badges. For us, it's how do we make our story accessible to people? Wine can become over geeky and over complicated, and how do we make it simpler without simplifying it too much?
Yeah, but then, I don't know, beautiful wines, happy, fulfilled employees, and healthy vineyards speak volumes, probably.
Yeah, and I think the people's part of that story is becoming a much more important part of it as well. And I think you're right. And then, because the whole world is suspicious of greenwashing, I think we need to take something out of things that are happening in food at the moment around being ultra transparent. And, you know, like with the whole movement for synthetic foods, those companies cannot be transparent at all, because they are often using, you know, genetically modified yeasts or something to get to the end point, or they are so processed and use so much energy that they can't be transparent. What's the antidote to that? Well, great natural food can be good for you, and we can be ultra transparent. So what does this wine have in it? Actually, the only thing we've added is a little bit of sulfur, nothing else. That just grapes that we've grown beautifully in an environment that people are happy, and it makes beautiful wine. So, but you got to be totally transparent. That's the thing that we'd like to try and bring to life.
Now, you mentioned Brian by his first name, Brian Sheth. You had quite an opportunity with all the experience that you've had to dream up what this complete model of an exciting project for the rest of your career potentially would be. What was the vision?
To be honest, when I finished at Craggy, it was such an enormous project. I was really wrung out, and I realised that I'd done what I could for Terry and his family, and it was time for them to take charge. And I had no plan for what I was going to do in wine at all. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking I might have done the greatest wine project ever, so there might not be another one. So, you know, that's where I got involved a lot in the Stanford University courses that I did, and did a lot of my government and strategy work and the Lincoln Chancellorship. It was just a chance. Brian and I first met in 2012 when he was in New Zealand at Craggy, and he came back in early 2015 with his wife. Actually, it was on like January the 3rd. I was on holiday, and his travel agent said, "Steve, Brian wants to see you for lunch at Craggy." I said, "Geez, I'm on holiday, man. I mean, you know, like really? Like I really need a holiday." Anyway, so I had lunch with him, and he'd found out that I was looking at leaving Craggy, and he said, "Look, if you want to do another project in wine, I'd love to do it. I don't want it to be like Craggy. I want it to be much smaller. But I really think there's a great opportunity around the Chardonnay and Pinot story." He's a great Burgundy lover, and he's a big environmentalist, and could see the climate change sort of thing happening in Burgundy. And I said, well, just give me a few months and we'll hatch a plan. And, you know, the plan came out that if we want to do something with Pinot and Chardonnay, we need to find just totally identifiable vineyards that no one else can make wine like that from, with an already existing brand with some opportunity to grow. Pyramid Valley was at the top of that list. But we didn't know whether we were going to be able to buy it. So I said, well, we want to start now, typical two entrepreneurial guys sitting around a table having lunch on a sunny day at Craggy, there's all sorts of bad things can happen. But that's where we hatched the idea of the Smith & Cheth brand, which is based on the idea of the great British wine merchants, the Berry's brothers and Rudds, who had amazing relationships with producers in France and Germany, but it came from trusting relationships with growers, and I had that in New Zealand, and I said, well, why don't we start this? This will be some fun. So we started that, and then Pyramid came from that, and the two businesses run together, but they have their own identity, even though the brands share the same values.
And I heard you talking about it the other day, which I hadn't heard before, this acronym or half acronym, Natural Made.
Yep.
And I really liked the sound of it, the way it brought everything together. It makes total sense from your skill set and personality, but tell us a little bit about what that stands for.
Yeah, so I think with any great, again, going back to my time at Villa with Steve Bridges, it's about what a brand stand for, what are the values that sit behind these brands. And if you're going to have a collection of fine wine brands operating together, they all needed to share the same values. So what were those values that those brands shared? And they become the anchor for making all of the decisions to do with those brands. So one of the words that was very strong in that was the word natural, whether it be the natural processes that were in use at Pyramid, which was going to be a core of everything, even though the Smith & Cheth wines are not biodynamic or organic. But that natural lean was very strong. But also that word means naturally being ourselves. So we're not trying to be Craggy, we're just going to be ourselves. That was pretty important. And then, the MADE acronym, modern, art, design, escape. Those were the words that came to the fore. And each of the four brands has parts of that in them. And the way that it works is with the different brands, you dial up different parts. So with Pyramid Valley, obviously, natural's dialed up very high, but art is very high, and so is escape. And the idea of escape is a really interesting one, because fine wine can do that to you at the end of a busy day. If you've had a hell of a day and you come home and you drag a bottle of Lion's Tooth Chardonnay out of the fridge and you put that in a glass, that's going to take you somewhere else. And it's the same feeling you get when you go to the vineyard. And we've taken that through to the experiences that we have at our cellar door and our little wine bar. It's like leave the rest of the world behind. So whereas Smith & Cheth, the whole modern design part of that is dialed up. So, and it becomes an anchor to make decisions. Like we just made a labelling decision for the high-end wines for Smith & Cheth, a couple of $150 bottles of wine we're going to release this year. We had two options on the table. I liked one option a lot. The rest of my team, Nat and MJ, liked the other option. So we went back to the values, and they were right. So I had to give up on it. But that's the point.
Yeah,
that's the point of those things. And
yeah, I particularly love the word escape.
Yeah.
I like the way the whole thing holds together, because I feel there's almost a nice tension as well between those concepts.
There is.
Which, again, it's a great thing in wine. But escape as well, more and more, I just think that when people are involved in wine, when they drink wine together, when they talk about it, the conversation goes anywhere, but it always goes somewhere exciting. So little of it is about the literal thing.
Yeah.
But one thing that strikes me is that there's an awful lot of literal stuff going on. A lot of marketing, dare I say, seems to revolve around the amount of points it's scored or the amount of dollars it costs. I just wonder how much more we can do to inject that idea of imagination, of a leap beyond the literal, to make wine feel more relevant to more people.
I think it's one of the most in-demand parts of today's world, because today's world is so challenging for people. This idea of escape becomes more important for everybody. And I think proper fine wine can do that. I'm not talking about the glamorous wines that I was talking about before, but these wines that come from a place that taste like, wow, what is that? Like, that's all of a sudden your brain's gone somewhere else, right? I've never tried anything like this. How can I find more about the story? At the moment, I think we're miles away from being really good at that. It's the next phase of what we need to do. But I think then all of a sudden you form a connection with somebody. And I think it's very, very hard for the corporate wine world to do that. But boy, it's something that we can do, because it sits right at our soul of these amazing properties that are a little bit isolated. And if you look at the branding and if you look at the wines and everything, it all knits together. Yeah,
and speaking of knitting together then, when people are escaping to that place that fine wine can take them to, they're situating themselves in a place, but also to a certain degree a way of believing the world should be or could be. Which brings me to this word that I definitely am not going to try to pronounce, but a Māori word that means our place to stand.
Yeah.
If you can say it, go for it, but also tell me what that means for you.
Yeah, so Turanga Waiwai, which means our place.
I could have done that.
Yeah, you could have done it, yeah. So once you get your head around it a little bit, it's not that difficult. So the interesting thing about Māori culture is, for many of us that are related to the land, we're becoming closer to that, and it's only been part of my generation that have been exposed to it and become intrigued by it, because Māori have been part of that land for a lot longer than we are. And they have some wonderful phrases, kaitiakitanga, which is the care of people in place, taiao, which is if the air is healthy, if the land is healthy, and if the water is healthy, the people will be healthy. So these concepts of Māoridom sit very comfortably with me, because that's just simple, a simple way to look about things. And to Rangawaiwai, it's like, this is my place, this is my home, this place is me and I am this place. It's as close as you can get to a replacement for the word te wā in our language, and in many languages actually, because te wā is about soil, climate and culture, people. It's not just about the first two. People forget that. And Turanga Waiwai is about my relationship with the land that I stand on. And it makes a difference when you're making decisions about what you're doing on that land, and you're thinking about, this land's been here for a long time, there have people been here before me, I'm the guardian right now, it's my place to stand, but there's going to be other people standing here in time. How do we respect all of that? That concept is spreading authentically through a number of different veins of New Zealand right now. It's probably going to take a generation or two to come out fully, but it's a fundamental part of what is a very multicultural country, and Māori are a very big part of that.
Okay, just the last couple of questions. The word optimism has come up in these conversations that I've been having, and the need for it and where you find it these days. Wine might be going through a hard time, but it also might be a way of finding optimism as well. Is there a way that you feel that wine is essential?
The optimism thing right now is hard, because the world is hard. Like I was talking before about the golden ages and the early parts of my career, can sometimes feel like the pre-apocalypse age, because there's so much changing in the world of wine and business and politics and wars and everything. We've just been through COVID, and I don't think people can underestimate how much that sits within people's minds. It's very hard to release yourself from that. And I think I have the confidence that what we have with Pyramid, with the wines we made in 24 and 25, the portfolio of wines that we've got together, and our connections in the world, that we've got a great opportunity now to actually take what we've done to the fine wine drinkers of the world and show, here we are. We haven't done that yet. So I'm confident of that. Whether I'm optimistic that's going to happen very quickly, I don't know, because is the world open-minded enough to that? The one thing that's exciting for me is that actually people talk about generational change, and I'm excited at the fact that Gen X and Gen Y are coming through with some love of wine, with a different set of values than the baby boomers, and that generation is a wealthy generation. They are in different parts of the world, like in North Asia and even in the UK, there's a whole generation of people that have got a different view, that aren't tarnished by it's got to be Burgundy or it's got to be Bordeaux, but they want a great experience with wine. The one thing that New Zealand has, and we found this out with our New Zealand storyboard work, is that when talking to people globally about New Zealand, people love the idea of New Zealand. And I think that's a real positive for us to start with. The thing that wine can do that no other beverage can do in this world is it is the best thing to celebrate with. It's a sparkling wine. There's nothing else close to a glass of champagne when you're celebrating something important. And there's no other beverage in the world that enhances a dining experience better than wine, apart from beautiful water. And it can give people hope that you can experience something that is from a place, that's made from a place by people that care about the place. And I think that's where we naturally sit.
Yeah, and going back to your word escape, I think the one huge advantage it has is it does actually bring together things that really do matter, like friendship, like nature, like the future, like the past, like tradition, and all kinds of other ethical values as well that you've mentioned. Wine probably matters because all those things matter.
Yeah. I think the wine world is a bit confused, because there's a part of the wine world that is exactly that, but then there's also the part of the wine world that's trying to be the cheap beverage, which I just don't think it's a place that we should be. It's sort of industrial wine versus fine wine and craft wine. But yeah, I think there is an absolutely unique thing that no other beverage has, for sure, that I think can connect people around a table, people anywhere. And we know that people that sit down and have a glass of wine with friends have the chances of living longer, because they're going to be healthier across all aspects than those that don't. And despite what the anti-alcohol movement say, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that works, and wine is the best connector for that, for sure.
I've kept you back a very, very long time, and it is Friday, so you're probably going to have a glass of wine at some point today.
I will.
What would you love to be the next wine that passes your lips?
That's a great question. It's this might sound strange, but an Etna Bianco.
Wow.
Those wines are special. We went to Sicily for the first time in 2013, and they are sensational wines, and they're just so refreshing. And after a long week, they make you feel better, because they are just, they taste of the volcano. They are so dramatic and tense and invigorating. So I think as a little pick-me-up for Friday, it might be that one.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed listening to it, please like, subscribe, and share with your tribe. Seriously, it makes a huge difference. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. Feel free to leave a comment too. I'd love to know what you'd like to hear more of. But for now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, my son Freddie for his laptop, and to my guest, Steve Smith MW. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers!